Imagine a game of chess where one side has no pieces left and still wins. You know, not through force, not through fear, but through something the other side never expected, through presence, through the sheer weight of being seen. That is the closest image I have for what happened somewhere between the 9th and 12th centuries when envoys from the archipelago we now call the Philippines walked into the courts of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever produced, and were received not as curiosities, not as tributaries, but as equals, maybe more than equals. The Abbasid Caliphate, at its height, was the center of everything. Baghdad was the city where knowledge, gold, and ambition converged. And into that center came men from islands so distant that most Arab geographers could barely place them on a map. What compelled those men to make that journey? And what did they carry that made the caliphate listen? To answer that, you have to go much further back than the diplomatic meetings themselves. You have to understand what kind of world the Philippine archipelago already was before Islam, before colonialism, before anyone outside Southeast Asia thought to write it down. Because the silence in the historical record is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a particular kind of erasure, slow, systematic, and almost complete. The barangay system was old, older than most people are comfortable admitting. By the time the Abbasid Caliphate was founded in 750 CE, the communities scattered across the Philippine Islands had already been trading with the Chinese, the Malay world, and the Indian Ocean networks for centuries. These were not isolated fishing villages. They were nodes in a vast web of exchange. Gold, beeswax, forest resins, cotton, and slaves moved through those waters in quantities that made merchants wealthy across multiple generations. The Datus who led these communities were not tribal chieftains in the romantic primitive sense. They were political operators. They understood leverage. They understood that trade was never just trade. It was always also diplomacy. And diplomacy, when practiced by people who have nothing to lose and everything to offer, looks different from what empires expect. Here is what the historical record does preserve, fragmented but present. Arab and Chinese sources from the Tang and early Song dynasties mention polities in the Philippine archipelago specifically by name. The Mai traders associated with what is likely Mindoro appear in Chinese court records not as passive recipients of Chinese favor, but as active agents negotiating the terms of their own exchange. They brought goods of specific and measurable quality. They sent representatives who could speak to the value of what they offered. Well, and crucially, they returned. Repeat visits mean sustained relationships. Sustained relationships mean something was working. That pattern, the repeat visit, the maintain channel, is the foundation of everything that followed. But what followed was stranger and more consequential than the trade records suggest. To be honest, the Abbasid Caliphate at its height was not simply a political entity. It was a civilizational project. Baghdad, under the early Abbasid caliphs, became a city of translation, of collection, of synthesis. The House of Wisdom drew scholars from every corner of the known world, and the Abbasids were genuinely curious about what lay at the edges of their maps. They sent their own travelers, they commissioned geographies, they wanted to know what was out there. So when envoys from the eastern islands arrived, and the evidence suggests they did, through the expanding Malay and Arab maritime networks that connected the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, the reception was not indifference. It was something closer to fascination. Let's say, but fascination is not the same as respect. How do you cross that distance? You carry something they cannot replicate. The envoys from the archipelago understood this intuitively because it was the same principle that governed trade at home. You do not arrive empty-handed. You do not arrive with imitations of what your host already has. You arrive with what only you possess, and what the archipelago possessed in abundance, in variety, in quality, was gold, Philippine gold, not just as a commodity. As a signal, gold worked with a sophistication that surprised people who expected roughness from the edges of the world. Gold that spoke of a civilization with its own aesthetic, its own standards, its own pride. Stop for a moment. Consider what it means to walk into the most powerful court on earth, carrying proof that you are not who they imagined. The diplomatic envoys from the archipelago were not performing submission. They were performing something far more difficult and far more durable. They were performing equivalence, and the Abbasid court, to its credit, had the intellectual machinery to recognize it. The Caliphate scholars and administrators were trained to categorize the world, yes, but they were also trained to update their categories when the evidence demanded it. When the envoys demonstrated knowledge of maritime routes, knowledge of commodity markets, knowledge of the political landscape of Southeast Asia, the response was not dismissal. The response was documentation. Those documents are what survive, in pieces. In the writings of Arab geographers like Ibn Khordadbeh, in the merchant accounts compiled and preserved in Basra and Oman, in the occasional reference that doesn't quite fit the narrative of a passive peripheral world waiting to be discovered. Scholars who have spent careers reading against the grain of colonial historiography have pulled these threads carefully. The picture they assemble is incomplete, but it is not empty. A generation later, and here the chronology matters, the Islamization of maritime Southeast Asia began accelerating. This is not coincidence. The diplomatic relationships that Filipino polities had built with the Arab world created channels. Those channels carried more than goods. They carried ideas, legal frameworks, religious practices, and the slow, complicated process by which a new faith becomes part of a living culture. The arrival of Islam in the southern Philippine archipelago was not an imposition. It moved through existing networks. It arrived through relationships that had already been tested and proven. That distinction between imposition and relationship is the one that colonial historiography consistently collapses. And collapsing it costs something real. What did Baghdad actually bow to? Not military power. The archipelago had no army that could threaten the caliphate, not geographic proximity. The islands were at the edge of everything. What the caliphate recognized, and this is the part that gets erased most completely, was the diplomatic sophistication of people who had built functioning political systems across thousands of islands without a single unifying empire to enforce compliance. The barangay system was, in its own way, a remarkable political technology. Distributed, resilient, adaptive, the caliphate's administrators, who spent their careers managing the tensions between center and periphery, understood the difficulty of what that represented. Governing islands is hard. Governing islands without losing the sea is harder. The Filipino polities had been doing it for centuries. Respect in the courts of the medieval world was never given freely. It was negotiated, and the envoys from the archipelago negotiated it. Here is the part that should make us pause. The erasure of this history was not primarily the work of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliphate's own records are more generous to the Eastern polities than the later colonial archives. The erasure happened later. It happened in layers. Spanish colonization brought with it a particular need to frame the archipelago as a place without history, because a place without history is a place that can be given one. The colonial project required a blank slate, and so the slate was, as much as possible, made blank. But blanks are never complete. Fragments survive. They survive in oral traditions that continued underground. They survive in the practices of communities in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, where the pre-colonial connections to the Islamic world were never fully severed. You know, they survive in the gold artifacts pulled from the earth, the Surigao treasure, the ornaments from Agusan, which speak with a precision that no colonial archive can contradict. You cannot fake a golden kinari with techniques that require centuries of accumulated craft knowledge. The physical objects are witnesses. They do not require translation. And then there is the question of what this history means now, not as nationalism, not as a political argument to be won or lost, but as a genuine philosophical puzzle about how identity forms across time. The Filipinos who negotiate trade agreements today, who navigate the pressures of larger powers with a particular kind of political intelligence, who build relationships across cultural difference with a fluency that surprises people who expect rigidity. Are they doing something new, or are they drawing on something very old? Cultural memory does not always travel through books. Sometimes it travels through practice, through the habit of certain behaviors that persist because they worked generation after generation, even when the context changed beyond recognition. The diplomatic instincts that brought envoys to Baghdad, the instinct to show up, to carry something real, to perform equivalence rather than submission, those instincts did not disappear when the caliphate fell. They went underground. They waited. By the way, the Abbasid Caliphate collapsed in 1258 under the Mongol invasion. Baghdad burned. The House of Wisdom was lost, and with it went a significant portion of the documentation that might have given us a clearer picture of what the Eastern Islands sent to that court and what the court sent back. This is a genuine tragedy of historical record-keeping, not a conspiracy, not a suppression by design, simply the catastrophic loss that follows when a city that served as the world's memory burns. What survived did so almost by accident. Copies made before the fall. Travelers who had already left Baghdad and carried their notes with them. Scholars in Cairo and elsewhere who preserved Abbasid learning in new institutions. The threads are thin, but historians who follow thin threads sometimes find that they lead somewhere unexpected. One of those unexpected places is the realization that the pre-colonial Philippines was never isolated. The very concept of isolation, which colonial historiography applied so consistently to the archipelago, was always a projection, a justification. The islands were connected, actively and deliberately, to the largest networks of exchange and communication that existed in the medieval world. And the people who maintained those connections were not passive. They were strategic. They understood that being at the edge of a map is not the same as being at the edge of everything. Maybe the most honest thing to say is this: the history we were taught about the Philippines is not wrong so much as it is cropped. What we were shown was real. What we were not shown was the frame, the vast context of diplomatic sophistication, of maritime power, of cultural exchange that made the colonial encounter something other than a meeting between civilization and its absence. And that cropping was itself a political act, one that continues to have consequences. Every generation inherits a version of its own past. What it does with that inheritance is not predetermined. Some generations receive a diminished version and accept it. Others receive it and start pulling at the edges, looking for what was cut away. The scholars who have spent decades recovering the pre-colonial history of the Philippine archipelago, working from Arab geographies, from Chinese court records, from Spanish colonial documents read against their own intentions, from the objects that the earth keeps returning. Those scholars are doing something that looks like archaeology, but feels like something else. It feels like listening. Like trying to hear voices that were told they had never spoken. The question that remains, the one that no archive can answer, is this: what would it change, truly change, in how a people understands itself if that history were not just recovered, but felt? Not as a source of pride to deploy against an argument, but as a lived sense of continuity, a recognition that the intelligence required to walk into Baghdad and be received as an equal is not ancient and gone. Well, it is present. It is here. It is the same intelligence that has navigated every pressure that came after. If it worked then in the court of a caliphate that had no reason to listen, what exactly are we capable of now?